policy and practice, advancing the empirical turn in language policy research, which is the topic of this presentation. So now let me give the floor to Florence and welcome.
Thank you very much, Shuhan. Thank you for this kind invitation. Thank you so much, Shaolan, for inviting me as well. It's lovely to be in Bath and to have the sun shining for us. I work in Edinburgh in Scotland, so the sun is not always with us. So it's a lovely and welcome also to people online. I can see we've got 25 participants. Some people are in the waiting room. Shall I let them in?
Yes.
Or can you do that? Shall I do that?
We can't.
Okay.
Was wrong.
So 4
today.
people entered in the waiting room. So
Yeah.
I will just invite the admit all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Why isn't we couldn't really get access to it? Strange. Yeah.
Yeah. Is that okay like that?
Yeah. I think it would be.
So can I just check that people online can hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, they're fine. Okay. Good. Okay. So so I'm delighted to be talking about language policy as practice, advancing the empirical turn in language policy research. This is also the title of my latest book that was edited and published by Palgrave. So this is an edited volume. So today I'll be talking about the notion of language policy as practice, which I call sometimes also practice language policy. And so I'll keep admitting people, yeah?
I'm so sorry.
That's okay, no worries. I can see Liane has joined us. Hello, Liane. And so I'll talk about, hang on, can I click on here? No.
Maybe I should go and sit on there.
Here.
And just click
If you want, yeah.
Yeah.
Can keep me company.
Yeah. I'm so sorry.
No, that's okay.
Yeah. Right, you keep on talking.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'll talk about, how the notion of practice language policy has came about. So first of all, I'll talk about how we conceptualize language policy, so different ways of conceptualizing language policy, and then how I conceptualize language policy as practice, or practice language policy. And I'll give you an example as well from my latest project about, how can we research practice language policy and why it's helpful. And the third thing I'll do is to talk about the kind of the most recent thinking I've had on the topic, which is how we can see actually practice language policy as being dynamic. Okay. And then I'll conclude with a few remarks and making the case for, why are we saying that this type of work is advancing the empirical turn in language policy research. And obviously it's not just my work. I'm talking about a body of work, colleagues working on practice language policy. Oh, thank you. So first of all, then, conceptualizing language policy. You'll all be probably aware, if you work in the field of language policy, that the concept of language policy is very much a debatable, blurry concept that has been defined in many ways depending on scholars' epistemologies, view of the world, view of language, etc. So there are many different definitions out there. So for instance, I've given you the how Fishman defines language policy. So he sees language policy as being the authoritative allocation of resources to language in general and to the written printed language in particular. So you can see how this definition, it's about, it's a very kind of macro understanding of language policy. It's seeing language policy as happening at the macro level. And, it's about political authorities who have the agency, who have the power in changing policy, and policy is about the allocation of resources, allocating money, right? So it's focusing very much on the macro level and governmental actions. Another view of language policy, which is very different, is, for instance, Shohami's work. So Shohami has done a lot of work on language in education policy, and she adopts more of a critical lens. So for her, she would say that language policy is a form of imposition and manipulation of language policy as it is used by those in authority to turn ideology into practice. So her, along with other critical language policy scholars, would look at, ideologies and discourses embedded in language policy. So it's obviously a complex and multi-layered phenomenon. For me, the kind of definition that really speaks to me in my own work is how Spolsky views language policy. So for him, language policy is what influences our language choices. Yeah. So it's kind of more a general definition. It's what influences our language choices. So he writes that language policy is all about choices. If you are bilingual or plurilingual, you have to choose which languages to use. Yeah. Even if you speak only one language, you have choices of dialects and style. So the question is then, what influences our language choices? Yeah. So if language policy is what influences, what is it that influences our language choices? So in my work, I make the argument that what influences our language choices is policy texts. Yeah. So regulations, constitutions. Yeah. And this is kind of the more traditional understanding of language policy. Yeah? Language policy is a text, okay? It's a constitution, right? So yes, we are sometimes influenced by policy texts, yeah? But we are also influenced by surrounding discourses. So our own beliefs about what should be done, about what languages should be used in a particular context, yeah? So all of these discourses influence our choices. But the key argument I am making in my work is actually what influences us most is also what usually happens around us. It's our observation of what usually happens around us. So what languages are usually spoken around me? Yeah. What is my sense that what languages are appropriate around me? Yeah. So in doing that, I'm actually drawing on two kind of scholars that have very much influenced me. The first one, as I said, is Spolsky. So Spolsky came up with this notion of language management, language beliefs, and language practices. So it's very much his idea that there is a policy at the level of language practices and what he calls what is usually done. Yeah, so what is usually done influences us, and that's why we can say it's a policy. The work of Ball as well, Stephen Ball, he's done more work in kind of educational policy, not language policy, but educational policy, but he's put forward those kind of two concepts of policy as text and policy as discourse, yeah? So what I've done then, and that's the next slide, yeah. So what I've done then is kind of drawing on that, I've proposed to transfer this concept into language policy. So language policy as text, language policy as discourse, and language policy as practice. So language policy as text, it kind of resonates with what Elena Shohami calls the declared language policy, yeah? So by text, I don't mean necessarily written, right? Text in a more general sense. So the declared language policy. So for instance, in the context of the home, for instance, if a parent says, on a Saturday, we speak French, okay, because Saturday is our French day. and the rest of the week we can speak English. That would be a declared policy. And then language policy as discourse, then I've kind of built on Shohami's declared. So then I said it's the perceived language policy. So it's, you know, asking people, what do you think is the language that's appropriate here, right? And then the practiced language policy is, so this notion of language policy is practice. So what do you think is, what do you feel that your implicit understanding of what language is appropriate? Okay, so let me tell you a bit more about language policy as practice then. So what is a practiced language policy? So it's conceptualizing language policy as practice. So what do I mean by that? I guess we, you know, in the field of language policy, there's been quite a, you know, a lot of work on, you know, studying what happens on the ground as well. So for instance, if we're looking at language in education policy, we would be looking at documents, doing interviews with stakeholders, teachers, pupils, parents, but we would also see at what happens on the ground, right? But usually the way that's done is we look at what happens on the ground, you know, what languages are used in the classroom, for instance, in relation to the declared policy, in relation to the macro top-down policy, right? So this is very much a language policy in practice, how it's implemented in practice. Whereas seeing language policy as practice is asking ourselves, what do classroom participants use as a point of reference to know what language or languages are appropriate in this classroom? And what we find is that most of the time, they do not refer to the macro top-down policy. What they refer to is their own policy that they've created in practice. You know, they've created in interaction, I should say. Yeah. Sorry, can I just go back? Yeah. So from the observation of practices, then speakers infer a set of norms. Okay, so what I mean by that is, so to go back to the example of a classroom, you know, pupils and teachers observe, you know, each other, observe what is done, right? And then they kind of infer a set of norms, a set of what is appropriate in terms of language choice. So a practiced language policy is therefore a set of interactional norms of language choice that influence speakers. Yeah, so it influences speakers. By that I mean it influences our production of language choice acts. So it influences our choices of what languages we're going to use. We're referring to this set of norms, but it also influences the way we interpret other people's language choice acts. Okay, so if suddenly you start speaking to me in a language that has never been used in this classroom, you know, and you know, you will get a reaction, you know, there will be surprise, there will be repair, all of that. The interesting thing is that a practiced language policy does not always align, it doesn't always match the declared or perceived language policy. All right, so to go back to an example of a multilingual classroom, it's often the case, for instance, that in a multilingual school, even if the declared top-down policy is monolingual, yeah, for instance, English only, in the school, we only use English, yeah, so that's a declared policy. If you go into the classroom, multilingual classroom, what happens is that you do hear other languages, right? Yeah, so that means that they've agreed among themselves to use a multilingual practice language policy, and that doesn't match the monolingual declared policy. So what do I mean by practice then? So the crosses is what I do not mean. So it is not a policy found at the level of what people do, yeah? So sometimes there is this misunderstanding that what I'm doing is conflating policy and language use. I'm not saying that policy is the same as language use, yeah? I'm not conflating those two. What I'm saying is that it is a policy that is found at the level of what people usually do. Yes, there's a difference, right? So it's what people usually do. That's what I mean by practice, okay, pattern. So it's what is conventional, appropriate. For those of you might be familiar with the notion of habitus, okay? So habitus influences us. So in a way, habitus is policy. So a practice is a pattern of language choice, right? So it's not about, as I was saying, the implementation of a language policy in practice. Yeah, that's different, okay? What we do instead is drawing on ethnomethodology, and we offer an emic perspective to language policy research. So if you're familiar with the notion of ethic and emic, so emic means, you know, it's trying to understand from the perspective of speakers themselves, not from my perspective as an analyst or researcher, from the perspective of the speakers or participants themselves. What do they use? What do they refer to in terms of policy when they decide what language to use? So it's from our observation of practices that we infer what is normative. So, yeah. So from this notion of practice language policy then, I've developed a practical approach to language policy research. So what does it mean, the practical approach? So it's using practice as an entry point to the study of language policy research. So Francis Holt, for instance, would say that there are many entry points to study language policy, right? Because it's such a complex and multi-layered process that actually, you know, we can study it by entering through different entry points. The entry point I'm proposing, and I'm doing my work, is to focus on practice. And by practice, I mean, as we said, what people usually do. So a practical approach to language policy research is also articulating language policy as practice, yes, but not focusing just on that. It's to articulate language policy as practice with language policy as text and discourse, okay? Today, I will mainly show you and talk about language policy as practice, but just for us to bear in mind that the ultimate goal, so to speak, is to, you know, in a project to look at policy as text, discourse, and practice. A practical approach is very much transdisciplinary in the sense that we are drawing on different fields and different fields. So so we are obviously, you know, working within language policy, but we also have to draw on research on talk. Yeah, since we're dealing with interaction, right? We need to know how to research interaction. So we need to kind of step outside of the field of language policy per se, as it, you know, was traditionally defined, and look into research on talk. And for instance, look at tools like conversational analysis, membership categorization analysis. And we also then need to look at research on multilingual talk. And in my own work, I've drawn a lot of on the work of Gaffaranga. So let me give you an example of a practice language policy. So that's taken from my latest project that I work with Elizabeth Barkos and Chen Shi, who was our research assistant. So our project is looking at language policy as text, discourse, and practice in higher education in an Anglophone country, so in fact in the UK. This is taken from two publications we've put together. Sorry, I'm not sure what happened there. The interesting thing in that context, and it might be the same at the University of Bath, actually, I don't know, is that we wanted to look at language policy in that particular higher educational context, but we soon found out that there was no language policy, right? So there was no declared language policy. So there was nowhere in that university that said English is the medium of instruction or English is the medium of assessment. Okay, it was written nowhere, right? But that does not mean there was no language policy, right? Because, you know, from what we said earlier, language policy is more than just text, right? So this is when then we turned to discourses and practices. So what we looked at is two masters in one UK university with a large group of Chinese students who in itself is a very much super diverse group. And we looked at a set of institutional documents around, in particular, notion of internationalization, globalization, and how they talked about language, if anything. And then we also looked at interactions, so actual practices, and we did a set of audio recordings over the set of one semester in two workshops. So I'm just going to give you 3 examples of extracts from this audio recorded corpus. So just before I show you the extracts, for those of you who are not familiar with looking at conversation analysis extract, this is just our set of transcription conventions. And so let's have a look then at this first extract. So T is an English and French bilingual teacher, and S or S2 is a student who speaks Mandarin and English. So I'll give you a bit of context first. So this is in a workshop, and the teacher is speaking to the whole classroom. So it's a teacher-led talk, okay? And the student is describing a new kind of idea they have about teaching languages, all right? And I think she wants to say, you know, she wants to use karaoke in her classroom, all right? So that's an idea she has. So I'm just going to read you what the student says. So you can read with me. So, and there is all those different kinds of theme songs and short video clips and games, from the famous cartoon characters, like a Peppa Pig, like Dora and whatever. And then you click on each of the games and songs, and sometimes there is there is a sing-along function. So you see here, so the student is kind of stopping, yeah, she's self-interrupting. Sometimes there is, so all those kind of hyphen means interruptions, and then there's hesitation markers like, yeah, the repetition, so there is a problem. Yeah, she's what we call, it's engaging in a word search, so she's looking for a word. So she's using English throughout, but at some point in line 14, she is missing a word, right? And that's important to us because when, you know, usually when someone who speaks more than one language misses the word, what we tend to do is turn to our other language. Yeah, so I can't say it in English, but I'm going to say it in this other language, all right? But here, what's interesting is that the student is not doing that. The student is not using Mandarin, yeah? So they could use Mandarin, for instance, to then ask a peer, you know, how do you say this again, yeah? And then you get help, right? Or even if the teacher doesn't speak Mandarin, you're just saying the word in Mandarin sometimes helps finding it in English, right? But none of that is happening, right? And then they eventually kind of find understanding when the students say for the theme song, so they can read the word. It's like a karaoke. Ah, okay, it's like a karaoke, yeah. So then they finally reach an understanding. But what this kind of extract shows us is that, remember, there is no declared language policy in that context. So nowhere does it say you have to use English only, right? And yet in practice, what do we see is that only English is used, even though they're all multilingual, right? And only English is used here. Even when there is a problem and you're kind of struggling with English, only English is used, okay? So then what does it mean for us as an analyst? So we're trying to understand what is the practiced language policy in that classroom. So we can make a first kind of hypothesis, so we can draw up a first norm of interaction to say this first extract indicates, or it seems to show, that in this classroom, from what we can see from this extract, only English is the medium of interaction, right? So this is what we see. And then we go back to our corpus and we look at different examples, and then we see this. So that's a little bit different because we see another language than English. Yeah. So here, this is still a teacher-led talk. Yeah. So the teacher is talking to the whole class. And she says, that's right. So that's the ability to take part in a conversation that hangs together. So she's explaining what cohesion and coherence is. Yeah. So it's to be coherent and cohesive. Yeah. But then in line 7 and 8, you can see, so you see those little brackets, that means that there is parallel talk. So that means the teacher is talking, yeah, but at the same time, it happens sometimes in the classroom, yeah, you've got like what we call like a side conversation, yeah. So in conversation analysis, we call that as kisming. What happens there is that two students turn to each other, yeah. And they use, what is that language? Do you recognize it? Yeah, is it Chinese? Can you read it? You probably read it much better than me. What does S4 say? Okay, so which one, is it this one? Yeah, yeah. And then she responds by saying, yeah, all right, it is this one, right? So what interests us here is that suddenly Mandarin seems to be allowed. All right, so we see another language that appears. So we need to revise our norm of interaction that we had come up with in the first extract when we said it looks like only English is allowed in this classroom. Actually, we need to revise that norm, right? And say, well, based on this, we can perhaps say that actually only English is allowed in teacher-led talk. So when the teacher talks and you're talking to the teacher, but when you're talking to your peer, yeah, Mandarin is allowed, okay? Or, you know, other languages than English are allowed, for instance. Okay, so let's try that and move on to the third extract and see if that norm holds, yeah? So our aim is to find a set of norms that accounts for the language choices. So in this third extract, we have here, again, a student talking together in that same workshop. And we've got two students that speak Mandarin and English, one on S5, and we've got S3, who this time speaks Spanish and English. All right. So let's read it together. So S3 says, in Spanish, we have a word, but I'm not sure how it is in English. Okay, so she's again trying to speak in English, but she's lacking a word, right? So the others are trying to help, right? So it's like when your skin is not like white, but it's not black. It's like, so S1 says in between, middle, in between. So in Spanish, the word should be right? So this is really what interests me in line 13. So in Spanish, yeah, she does that. So again, in bilingual, you draw to your other languages. In Spanish, the word should be, so she's about to switch to Spanish and about to say the word in Spanish that she's trying to say, right? But you see what happens here. There's someone that talks at the same time as her, that cuts her, right? And says, is it natural or is it from like the sun tanning? Yeah, it's because of the race. Yeah, okay, yeah. So you see here, what's interesting is that she's trying to use another language. She's trying to use Spanish, but she's being interrupted. So it's how others react to that potential language choice, and it's not happening. So based on that, we kind of need to revise our, the norm that we had come up with. So in extract 2, we'd said, what did we say? In extract 2, we'd said, in teacher-led talk, only English is allowed, but other languages seem to be allowed in peer interaction. Yeah. So actually, it's not other languages are allowed. It's Mandarin is allowed in peer talk, but not any other languages. Yeah. Not Spanish. Yeah. So perhaps it's something like, if it's a language that is not shared, because she was the only one speaking Spanish, you see, because it's a language that's not shared, yeah, maybe that's why it's not allowed, you see. So then we come up with this set of norms. And obviously, I've just shown you 3 extracts. We would do that across much more many extracts, right? But this is just to give you a sample, like a taste. So then we come up with a series of norms and say, well, we've seen that English is the only medium of instruction that is appropriate in teacher-led talk. We've seen that in extract 1. Other languages are appropriate in student-led talk, but only if they are shared by all participants. Yeah, this is what extract 3 showed us. Yeah, and no room is made for languages that are not shared. Okay, so we don't hear French, which is the language of the teacher. We don't hear Spanish, which is the other language. And also to switch a medium of language choice, sometimes you have to switch a choice of participation framework. A switch of participation framework is often required, because as we saw in extract 2, suddenly the students used Mandarin, but they didn't use Mandarin with a teacher. They had to switch, leave that conversation, start a side conversation to be able to feel comfortable to use Mandarin. So this is what a practice language policy looks like. But the issue is that, well, something that I see a bit of as an issue is that it looks like a list of norms. Yeah. So we're making a list of norms. So it is helpful to the extent that it gives us a policy, like a written policy in a way, and we can say, this is what the policy is, the practice policy is in our classroom. But because it looks like a list of norms, it gives the false impression that practice language policies are static and fixed, right? While we know exactly that what is appropriate in terms of social action varies. It varies all the time, according to different factors. And also it gives the impression that the list we're offering is exhaustive, okay? Whereas it's absolutely impossible to actually give a full rendition of a practice language policy, because talk keeps evolving all the time. Okay, so practice language policy as well. So based on that, my recent thinking has been to kind of show how practice language policy is dynamic. Right? So I'm going to tell you a bit more about what I mean by that. So I argue that practice language policies are dynamic. And this kind of dynamic nature is characterized by 3 elements, in my view. The first one is the dimensions of a domain. The second one is the potential lack of reciprocity of perspectives. And the third one is the ongoing emergence of new norms. And I'm going to explain that one at a time. So let's first look at the dimensions of a domain. So as I've shown you, practice language policy are very much situated. Yeah, so that means that the practice language policy I've observed in those 2 workshops, that doesn't mean that it's the same practice language policy in other workshops in that university. It doesn't mean it's the same practice language policy in workshops in all UK universities, right? Practice language policies are very much located, they're very much situated in one context. You can't generalize, yeah? And there is a strong relationship between, so Fishman has shown that there is a strong relationship between social linguistic domains and the language choice. So he's shown that, for instance, the social linguistic domain of the home, yeah, some people have a language they speak at home. That's a language associated to the social linguistic domain of the home, right? But then when they go to work, they use another language. And then when they go to church, they use again another language, yeah? So Fishman has shown that when you move across different social linguistic domains in your life, you kind of move language choice. And then Spolsky, building on that, said there is also a strong relationship between domains and language policy, yeah, which makes sense, right? So there is a language policy in my family, but when I go to work, there is another language policy. And then when I go to church, there's another language policy, yeah? So based on that, I've argued that actually, you know, I've kind of given more granularity to this idea to say that it's the dimensions of a social linguistic domain. There's a strong relationship between the dimensions of a social linguistic domain and practice language policies. So the dimensions of the social linguistic domains are threefold: the participants, topic, and location. And a shift of domain can lead to a shift of norm of language choice. So I'll show you that in more detail. So for instance, participants, what characterizes a domain, right, is the participants who we speak to, okay? So at home, it could be there are family members, and the school, as the teacher, our peers. And norms of language choice can vary according to groups of participants, okay? So for instance, in the work I've just shown you, in the teacher-led talk, they had one norm, English only, but then when they switched participants and they just talked to their peer student, then Mandarin was okay. So you see how who you speak to, then different languages are allowed and become available, yeah. The other one is topic, okay? So norms of language choice can also vary according to topics, all right? So for instance, in the book I've edited recently, there's a very good chapter by Zhang Hao, who shows how norms of language choice in a primary school in Scotland, in Mandarin classes in a primary school in Scotland, he shows how norms of language choice change according to the pedagogical task. So depending on what the teacher is doing with the children, there's different norms of language choice. For greeting, there's one norm. For something else, there's another norm, etc. And then the third aspect of a domain is location. So norms of language choice can vary according to location, or what's Fishman calls situation. So for instance, in a classroom, you might have a norm, but in the playground, you might have another norm of language choice. At the canteen, you might have a different norm of language choice. There is actually very little research focusing on the relationship between practiced language policy and space. In fact, I'm not aware of any, but please correct me if I'm wrong. So, but questions I could see would be interesting would be, for instance, do shifts in location lead to shifts of practiced language policies? Or how do speakers negotiate various practiced language policies as they move in and out of different spaces? Yeah, we're constantly moving, we're mobile people, right? So how, when you move in and out of spaces, how do you negotiate all the shifts of different policies? The second aspect of the dynamic nature of practiced language policy is the potential lack of reciprocity of perspective. So what do I mean by that? It's a concept used in ethnomethodology mainly. It's the assumption that social actors hold each other to have the same perspective. So it's assuming that we all see the world the same way, and we all orient to the same practice language policy, because it's an assumption, okay? However, what I've seen is that, yes, perhaps we orient to the same practice language policy, but not to the same norm within that practice language policy. So I'll just show you a quick example from the same data set. So here, without going into too much detail, you can see that they're using English, and then at some point, S1 switches to Mandarin, right? So then what we want to do is at the next turn, to look at the next turn. So how do participants react to that choice of Mandarin? So we're looking at here, S3, line 8. And then S3, who does not understand Mandarin, she kind of laughed and she said, ha 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 ha, yes, ha ha ha, what, ha ha ha, yeah? Okay, because she does not understand Mandarin, right? So she's kind of pointing out to the fact that this is a repairable matter. You can't use Mandarin because I do not understand it, yeah? So you can see at this point how S1 was orienting to one norm saying, I'm allowed to use Mandarin here, so I'm going to use it. But S3 says, actually, hang on, we don't all understand Mandarin here, so you're not allowed to use it. So there's a bit of negotiation happening, okay? So it's not a straightforward matter. Initially, it looked very straightforward, but it's always a bit of negotiating happening. And then the last point is also to bear in mind that norms are constantly emerging as we talk, okay? So something that looks inappropriate today, okay, might not be tomorrow or in a week time. Okay, the norms of interaction I've shown you in that workshop. If I go back to these workshops now, maybe the practice language policy will be very different. Okay. So then to conclude, why do we say that this type of work is advancing the empirical turn of language policy? And so first I should say that, you may be familiar with the fact that the field of language policy has been divided in different turns, and the latest turn, as Johnson and Ricento have defined it, is called the empirical turn. Yeah. So the empirical turn, it puts a strong emphasis on agency, right? And I've kind of named some two key references here. So the strong emphasis in the empirical turn is on agency. So who has agency in language policy processes, not just the people at the top, but any social actors. And it also has a strong emphasis on practices, okay? But it usually investigates practices in relation to top-down policies. There are existing approaches in the empirical turn, such as the ethnographic approaches, discursive approaches, scalar approaches. And what I'm proposing then is the practical approach. So we're saying that this is advancing the empirical turn, but we're proposing another approach, which is the practical approach, by seeing language policy as practice. Okay, so by adopting an emic perspective to language policy research and understand what policy speakers refer to when choosing what languages to use. We also see language policy as being dynamic. And also, I really love that expression by Teresa McCarty, who wrote the afterwards in the book I edited, and the title of the chapter is Humanizing Language Policy Research. So she says that this type of work is humanizing language policy, which I think is a beautiful expression. This is just a quick overview of how this kind of field is expanding, just to show you the amount of work that people have done on using the notion of language policy as practice in different domains. So the school, the home, the workplace, higher education, healthcare settings, public spaces, with a very latest paper here in 2025, computer-mediated communication as well, looking at WhatsApp conversation, for instance. Yeah, and so if you are interested in finding out more about, how people are using the concept of language policy, I would strongly encourage you to have a look at this Palgrave volume. It's really a really fantastic collection of chapters where scholars are showing how they use the notion of language policy as practice, using different types of data, right? So in my work, I use interaction, classroom interaction, you know, and others here I've used, for instance, digital practices, writing practices, and also new methods. So I use conversation and analysis, but there's 2 chapters in this book of authors proposing multimodal conversation analysis and how can that be used to study practice language policy. Yeah, so I'll stop here, and I hope we have time for questions. I think I've finished just on time. Thank you for doing that clicking, Shaolan. That was very nice.
Well, thank you very much for this very enlightening talk. Okay, I shouldn't really say anything. I forgot my role. Xuhan or Jiao, which one is doing the conclusion for question? Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for the inspiring talk. And now we will go to the question session. And
yeah, well, open question to the online. Yeah, online. Well, I don't think we have anyone. You can post your question.
Maybe,
yes, I could take over.
Yeah. Okay. No one.
Yes, you have a question. Yes.
Thank you so much. This is really, very interesting.
Oh, thank you so much.
And my question, because you talked about the practical language policies.
Yeah.
I was wondering, and you mentioned about the practical language policies. It's a kind of, you know, the examples you gave is about kind of, you know, in classroom or people get together or something like this. And I was wondering, do you have an idea about you know, when people stay individual and about their language choice?
Yeah, so by individual, you mean when they're by themselves?
Yes, stay with themselves. So for example, like me, you know, when I stay with myself and I like to think about something, sometimes I use Mandarin, but sometimes I like to use English to talk with myself. So I know it's kind of, you know, weird action, but I really wondering, is a kind of such kind of language policy at this moment?
Well, that's interesting. So yeah, so you're right. So in my work, I've looked at interaction among people. Yeah. Whereas you're talking about when you speak to yourself, do you think?
Yes.
Think perhaps? Oh yeah, interesting. No, I don't have any data like that. I'm not sure how, you know, how I would actually, you know, capture that. But yeah, so in a way, that's a very interesting question. So the question is, what influences my language choices? Yeah.
Yes.
So are you influenced by you know, by discourses? Obviously, it's a very intimate space because it's your own thoughts, right? So I'm not sure. What would be the influence there?
I got this question because I have a friend. She can speak at least 5 languages, I suppose.
Right.
So she told me once, she said, sometimes you just speak a lot of language together to express the same thing, you know, in a sentence, a lot of language, English, French, or Arabic or something, just together.
Yeah.
So I asked her once, what makes you, you know, just to think about this or try to express yourself in this way? And she said, so she asked me a question, I think it's very interesting. She asked me, when you describe a chair, you just react to this word in English or react to this word in Mandarin. And I asked her, how about you? Because my answer is definitely Mandarin first, and then translate it into English.
All right, yeah.
When you become very familiar with English, and this word just come directly.
Yeah.
You know, you just shorten your thinking process, but you still use that system to speak. But she said, when I think about chair, it first come with the image.
All right, yeah. Yes.
There's a comment from Harvey.
Uh-huh.
And he said, regarding the question about individual practices, there is some research on children's imaginative play. So when children are playing
yes.
by themselves, they always, use different languages. right?
Yeah.
Sometimes it can be a language that used in the home.
Yeah.
Sometimes you play as a teacher, so you use a school language.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
Yeah.
Because you were talking about the language you use in your own head. This is example of individual practices. So I'm assuming that imaginative play, the child would still verbalize, talk out loud, but they're on their own and they're playing with toys. Yeah, that would be interesting. Yeah.
I have a question. You talk about people moving in and out of space.
Yeah.
May change their language policy.
Yeah.
How this is space
Yeah.
is different from domain. How
Yeah.
is it similar or is it different? Or
I think it's actually different because what I'm saying is that location is a dimension of domain, right? So it characterizes domain, yeah.
space?
But space in itself, I would say that actually you can't change space within the same domain, right? So for instance, I don't know, the domain of the family, I'm assuming that you have different space where you do family, where you are a family, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So how does that influence your language choices? Or if you're in school, so the school is, a domain, but in school itself, you would have different spaces. And I wonder, again, there isn't really any research that I'm aware of, but I wonder if there are norms, the norms vary according to the space. So we know that norms vary according to topic, participants. Does space matter? I suspect it does.
It does, yeah. One of my studies, we observed that the students, after class.
Oh, yes.
During free time.
Yes.
And then they speak a language.
Yeah.
Which is of course not school language.
Yes.
And Jingyao knows about it, and her work also deals with that.
Yeah.
So the students got scolded by teacher.
Yes.
So
yeah.
Private space and public space.
Yes.
Within
like
school.
Yeah, that's lovely. Yeah. Yeah, thank you for that. So then it's kind of saying there is a norm of language choice that's okay in a private space that's different from what's okay in a public space. Yeah. Yeah.
There's also still a question from Hadi that would space not be closely related to Goffman's frame? That is, in the same domain, we can switch across frames in interactions, and that would inform our language choice.
Yes, as well. Yeah, I'm assuming. Yeah. That could be another kind of lens to look at it as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. In the work I did, so in the higher education project, I've got a chapter with Chen Shi, which I think I showed earlier, where she's the first author, and she shows how the notion of participation framework kind of plays a key role as well. So participation framework is who do we speak to, the groups of people we speak to. So she's using that lens to show that even in the same space of a classroom, depending on which group we interact with, then the norms of language choice will be different. Yeah.
One of the comments over there, thanks.
Oh yeah, that's a long
That's-
comment.
Yeah, 17. Yeah.
Very interesting. Thanks, Flores. Thinking about context, as you say, PLP vary according to people, places, and topic, and they may differ from declared language policy. Is there a way to understand how practices are shared between contexts and how much the declared policies and discourses in certain situations may influence what practices speakers carry with them to other contexts? I'm thinking, for example, the children in my study who say that they can speak English in a country, in a courtyard of the complementary school, but not in class, and wonder how much of that is actually the discourse that children bring from a different place.
Yeah. So
That's very similar to Shellen said.
Question, yeah, what's about, is there a way to understand what practices are shared between contexts? So I'm not sure I understand the question. So is there a way to understand and how much the declared policies and discourses? Yeah, so as I said in today's talk, I talk mainly on language policy as practice, because I guess that's kind of the more, new thing that I'm trying to bring in. But ultimately, ideally, we would want to look at language policy as text, discourse, and practice. So we would want to look at the declared policies and the discourses and how also these influence speakers, right? So then it becomes quite complex because we've got this practice language policy, which in itself, varies according to domains, But then we also have discourses, and then we also have text. So it's actually, it's a very complex endeavor, and I think it's impossible to try and draw all the connections between all those layers, right? I think it's impossible to give an exhaustive representation and account of what influences speakers. What Spolsky was saying is that actually the most powerful of all language policy is the language policy as practice. It's practice, yeah. Because when we talk, we're not wondering what's written in that text, right? But we're more influenced by what do I see around me? What is appropriate around me? But obviously that's a biased answer. But yeah, I mean, even though it is a complex task, I think it's definitely worth doing, and I think we need to look to try and account for all of that. So I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Carmen.
Yeah.
Carmen.
Carmen, yeah.
I am thinking that, when you talk about this language choices,
Yeah.
does it only work for people who have multiple languages?
Oh, yeah.
But then we're thinking about even monolinguals,
Yeah.
like you cited Spolsky, and it's a choice of a dialect.
Yeah, yeah.
But very often, the language that we choose to use is
Yeah.
influenced by our familiarity and
Yes.
the habitus practice,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
can we call that a type of language policy, or is it just practice?
Ah, yeah. So yeah, I would. So your question, you're asking if even if we are monolingual, yeah, and we have a choice of different varieties, perhaps, can we talk about practice language policy then?
Yeah. Well, is it
Just policy? Yeah,
Yeah.
I would say so. Yeah, I would say. But again, I haven't done research on that, but my assumption, my hypothesis would be that, yeah, I think, yeah, very much so. So what influences the variety I choose to use here and there? Yeah.
Yeah, okay. And so one
and there's another
question said, is translanguaging a language policy?
That's an interesting question. So I guess, translanguaging is, the use of multiple, in a very basic understanding, it's the use of multiple languages in interaction. So yes, I would say that translanguaging, as the multilingual practices I've shown you in my extracts today, they are, I wouldn't say they are policy, but they are very much influenced by policy. Yeah, they're influenced by practice language policies, and sometimes, there are contexts where the practiced language policy is multilingual. So that means the practiced language policy says that it is okay, it is appropriate to, use multiple languages fluidly and dynamically. Yeah, there are many contexts where it's absolutely appropriate.
Any questions from the audience? No.
We're about to.
No more questions.
Good, but these are very good questions. Yeah, thank you for engaging. And if you want to, obviously we only have like 15 minutes for questions, but if you want to then, continue this conversation, whether you've been online or you in person here, feel free to email me. I'm always happy to continue the conversation either via email, or we can arrange some sort of Zoom Teams meeting. And I'd love to hear about your work as well, if it resonates with that. Yeah. Okay.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Now
Yeah.
for-
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you again very much, Sharon, for the invitation.
We would really like to, someone is asking whether we could share the recordings and, yeah.
Yes,
this is a
the
very-
recording will be uploaded on YouTube later.
YouTube.
Yeah, but you have to access that, can we just access it from anywhere, or you have to go through our
Can we?
website?
Yeah, can we?
I'm sorry. I think, you have to do it through our.
Is it a
Also, internal-
private link or is it
Yeah.
a public
Oh,
link?
okay.
Yeah.
Public link.
Okay, yeah. That's
Great.
good.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah,
Wow,
thank you.
kilos, so much, yeah. That's
It does.
Finland. People from.
Oh,
Finland-
right.
Yeah, we have participants from almost everywhere.
Oh, right.
Finland,
Yes.
yeah,
Oh, thank you very much for
Australia,
coming.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it's wonderful, yeah.
The joy of hybrid talks.
Yeah,
Yeah, brilliant.
Great, yeah,
Yeah.
thank you so much. yeah.
Okay, thank
So
you,
if there's
everyone.
no more question, we finish our session now, okay?
Okay.
And
Can you
Florence
stop
hasn't
the
had
Yeah.
lunch.
recording? Yeah.
She must be